Do you buy wine in Ontario? Well, I've got some news for you. Have you been drinking less wine than you were, let's say, in the past? Well, I've got news for you too. And you know that silly policy that the Canadian Ministry of Health came out with that said you can only drink 2 glasses of wine per week? Well, I've got news about that too. All that and so much more on this episode of The Average Wine Enthusiast. Hi there, everybody. My name is Mike LaPlante, and I'm the Average Wine Enthusiast. On this episode, what we are going to do is not something that I normally do, and that is relay some news. Why don't I normally do news? Because news isn't news for long. And I want the content on my YouTube channel to remain relevant no matter what. Whereas the content here, if it was always news, it would eventually get stale. Whereas you go back 2 years and check out my Menthea episode, you'd find that all the information in that episode is still relevant today. By the way, go and search out some Menthea for your cellar or for your belly, one or the other. So what compels me to do the news in wine? Well, this is the kind of news that has far-reaching consequences for you, the wine consumer, and the wine industry as a whole. First piece of news is about the LCBO. So this is a bit of a, it pertains only to a certain portion of the world. Speaking of the world, the LCBO is the largest buyer of wine on the planet. Insane. You go to Portugal, you go to a winery, they've heard of the LCBO. You go to Italy, they've heard of the LCBO at a winery there because they buy a ton of wine. We won't get into their business practices right now, monopoly, but what they plan on doing within the next 2 years. I know it's a long stretch, but that's why I'm telling you now. They have a plan that isn't full of details, but the concept is there. And that plan is to decentralize the sales of beer, wine, and ciders. They are catching up with the rest of the world. If you go to most European countries, if you want a bottle of wine, what you would normally do is head to the grocery store or a winery or your neighbor who's probably growing grapes and making its own wine. But for the most part, as far as people buying wine, that takes place in grocery stores. What a concept. Food, wine, I don't know, it all kind of goes together. So that's what they plan on doing here in the province of Ontario, up here in the Great White North, is they're going to create 8,500 new retail locations for the sale of beer, wine, and ciders. Lots of good things can come out of this, obviously. It's going to be good for the environment. For one thing, you don't have to drive to a specific location. I don't know how many. I live in a city of about 250,000. And, I have to drive a certain distance to get to my liquor store. I might have passed 2 or 3 grocery stores on my way to the liquor store. So obviously I can get it at more locations. I don't have to drive as far. It's not going to be just grocery stores either. It's going to be convenience stores and gas stations. You're going to be able to pull in and grab a 6-pack of Bud and head on away and throw your beer cans in the back seat. No, don't do that. So that's happening. What's going to happen to the beer store? The beer store is actually called The Beer Store. If you're not from Ontario, that's the name of the place where a lot of beer is sold. So the LCBO basically said your contract is up in 2026 and we're going to a different model. So I don't know what the beer store is going to reinvent itself, let alone the actual LCBO locations. Well, they'll definitely be the location where you buy spirits. They're not letting that go. And I think the more alcohol is in something, the more tax they can charge. I'm not exactly sure how that goes. But the government's all behind it, and I hope it leads to more availability of more wine to people who want to get their hands on some different, fun, and yummy wine. So that is a big change that's coming here to Ontario. Welcome to the modern world, Ontario. Jeez, that took a while. The next piece of news I want to talk about is wine consumption in general. I follow a pretty predominant economic association called the American Association of Wine Economists. And they put out all kinds of fun data, a lot of graphs and, talking points. And one of the ones that keeps coming up is how wine consumption is going down. I'm going to put a chart up right here. And as you can see, the sales of spirits has increased. Not a lot. It does have its peaks and not much of a valley in there. And as well as beer. Beer has also increased its share of the alcohol sales, maybe due in part to the fact that there's so many craft and artisan beers out there and available that, since the beer industry has upped its game, people are drinking more beer. Are those two things at the detriment of wine? I don't know, but there's a reason why wine consumption has been cut basically in half, as you can see by the chart here, that wine sales are going down. What does that mean for us wine lovers? Well, there's a lot of factors that could, come into play here. Less wine sales means that wineries are selling less wine, which means many of them will just back out of growing grapes and making wine and go into some other enterprise. The fields where the grapes are growing, you might find an orchard or apricot trees or something. So obviously the lack of consumption of wine is going to change the crops that are growing, and it'll also affect the availability of wine. So there'll be less wine available to the fewer people who are actually drinking wine. I can't see that as a good thing. I like, everybody wants a thriving industry, whether it's beer or wine or whatever. And the lack of consumption of wine is definitely a concern for the wine industry as a whole, globally. Speaking of drinking wine, I found out through a podcast that I listen to called Wine for Normal People. And it had this woman on there who did some research about how the World Health Organization is setting guidelines for alcohol consumption for the world. So countries base their economic policies on the World Economic Forum, and countries base their trade practices on the World Trade Organization, and civilized countries, base their health policies on what the World Health Organization says. Obviously, we should be somewhat familiar with the World Health Organization, since they had a big part in helping us deal with COVID. Did they make some mistakes? Darn right they did. But they are still, they're the source of the information. It's like they're the leaders in at the forefront of where we should be going as a planet to keep the people who are living here healthy. So what I've talked about here on the show is the country of Canada. They recently told us that there is a certain amount of alcohol that you should drink before it becomes unhealthy. And that amount is 2 glasses of alcohol, 2 servings of alcohol per week for a man, 1 for a woman. Doesn't matter what size they are or anything. It's just 2 for a man, 1 for a woman. What if you're non-binary? Or what if you identify as a... Never mind. Obviously, these numbers are whacked as far as I'm concerned. There's scientific proof that low to moderate consumption of alcohol has some beneficial effects to us humans, especially cardiovascular. We know that low to moderate amounts of alcohol is not bad for us. However, the World Health Organization is basically saying no amount of alcohol is safe. You should not be drinking alcohol. Now, why would they be saying this? There's studies out there, scientific proof that this is not the case. Well, this woman who's on the podcast, I wish I could think of her name right now. I'll put her name up right over here. And she found out that the World Health Organization gets its, I'm going to call it propaganda, that they pass off as policy from an organization known as the International Order of Good Templars. We're talking about Templars? Isn't that like olden golden days? Yes, it is. So they changed their name to something else so we don't even, think, oh, this must be a very studious organization that's guiding the World Health Organization as far as alcohol consumption is concerned. No, not at all. These people, the International Organization of Good Templars, is concerned with one thing, and that's temperance. And you know what temperance is? That is no drinking. Drinking is bad. So obviously, the World Health Organization has no issue with, telling countries like Saudi Arabia or Iraq that no amount of alcohol is good for you. They say, yeah, no kidding. That's our religion tells us that, and our government is run by our religion, so that's right. You guys got it right on the head. But we know that that's not true. Low to moderate consumption of alcohol is not bad for most people. If you have some kind of pre-existing condition, well, then maybe. But in general, we have a pretty good set of statistics that let us know that if you drink a certain amount of alcohol, it's not going to be harmful to you. I don't know if you remember, maybe a month ago, I put something out about the French had a poster, keep your alcohol consumption down to 1 liter of wine a day and you'll be okay. We went from 1 liter to 0, basically. In Canada, they're saying 2 glasses a week, which is that for a special occasion? I'm not sure. But obviously, this is not good for the wine industry or the beer industry or the spirits industry or any of that. So, there's countries like France and Italy, Portugal, Spain, they're a big part of their culture is wine. And for you to tell these people they can only have 2 glasses of that wine a week it's preposterous. It's I don't get how this can pass as policy, and our government here in Canada wholeheartedly supported it, and that's the policy that they're handing down. So I don't know what to say about it other than it's wrong that this kind of information is being given to us based on what some temperance group is pushing on the World Health Organization. Just to let you know what it's all about. If you can check out the podcast over there with Elizabeth Schneider at Wine for Normal People. Great podcast. I guess that's going to do it for the news. What am I drinking? We've got to talk about some kind of wine here. So I just got a big shipment of wine from Blasted Church. And they are in the Okanagan. They're just south of the Okanagan Falls in British Columbia. And I always liked their wine. And it was one of the first wineries I went to where I realized British Columbia makes some kick-ass wine. And they are basically running low on their GSM blend, which is Grenache, Mourvedre, and Syrah, but they label it as Mourvedre, Syrah, and Grenache because it's 1/3 of each, and I think the Mourvedre is 34%, and the Grenache and Syrah are 32 and 33. So it's basically 1/3 of each in that. And so I bought a case of that because guess what? There was a big freeze. More news that you may not know about. Yeah, there was a horrible weather event in British Columbia that they have to recover from. And when they come out on the other side of it, things will definitely be looking different. But so we cannot expect to see much Grenache or Mourvedre coming out of British Columbia, let alone Syrah, even though I did see some good news about some Syrah in British Columbia yesterday. So anyway, part of my shipment, well, part of it was a case of this GSM, and then I got a whole bunch of other goodies from Blasted Church. If you're ever in the neighborhood, I highly recommend going to Blasted Church. And this is the first wine I opened for my shipment. It's called Hatfield's Fuse, which I assume that the person who blew up the church, they didn't blow it up actually, they just let up some dynamite to loosen nails in the church so they can move it. Crazy story. Go to the winery and let them tell you the story. So Hatfield, I believe, was the guy who probably lit the dynamite to get the blasting started at Blasted Church. And so they call this Hatfield's Fuse. And in this is a mixture of Viognier, which is the biggest proportion of this bottle, 39%. Gewürztraminer, 16%, Chardonnay, some Muscat in there, some Pinot Blanc, some Sauvignon Blanc, all to make for a crazy blend of white wine. Beautiful smell of lemons and green apples. But on the palate, it's just so dynamic. It just, so many layers of it. And it keeps going. It makes you want to pucker up and take another sip of that right away. A delicious wine. Carl, which is where I got this from, Carl Boucher over at Carl's Wine Club. He gave it an 89. I think he gypped this out. I opened this yesterday, and it tastes maybe just a little bit better today. And it's at the proper temperature as well. Delicious white. Will go with a lot of food. The acidity is there, the finish is there, just enough alcohol to let you know that it is wine, 13% on the nose. So head to Blasted Church on the internet, order some wine from them. I highly recommend it. Order a case and I think it's free, which is becoming kind of the norm now. They want to sell you their wine out there in British Columbia, and they want to ship it to Ontario, even though it's supposedly not really all that legal. But anyway, I guess that's going to do it for this episode. I'd like to thank the Big Organ Trio for letting me use their music on the show, and I'd like to thank you fantastic YouTube watcher, for watching the Average Wine Enthusiast. If you have friends who are like you, are into wine, and who would be watching YouTube videos about wine, turn them on to the Average Wine Enthusiast. I'd really appreciate it. Till next time, my name is Mike LaPlante, and I'm the Average Wine Enthusiast. Salute!